So let's take a look at this video by Ziostorm. Why are people so mad about Elden Ring? So the description of the video says, with the Game Awards coming up soon, some people are very upset that Elden Ring was nominated for Best Narrative. This reaction appears to come from the misconception that Elden Ring has no story or that lore does not count as narrative. Elden Ring is a 20... Okay, this just describes Elden Ring. Now, my opinion on this is actually, and maybe I'm getting something a little bit wrong there. For starters, I'm not upset over Elden Ring being nominated for Best Narrative because there's no Best Story category in the Game Awards. Now, to me, I have a very clear distinction between narrative and story. To me, story is one thing. Narrative is the way in which that story is told, usually through characters, because narrative kind of implies narration, so character dialogue, stuff like that. That's the way that I personally look at it. Maybe I have the wrong definition of narrative, but that's the way that I look at it, which is why I believe that when it came to picking those two, I remember picking God of War and specifically saying, I like the story of Elden Ring better. I think that Elden Ring has a better story, but I think that God of War has a better narrative, if that makes sense. That is my opinion. But again, I'm not mad because they're both fantastic games. So personally, I don't care that much about, about being upset over it. It doesn't upset me one bit. I'm going to like the video in preparation, but also you guys should make sure to play this while we are watching it so that Ziostorm gets some more watch time and stuff like that. Put it playing in the background and mute the pain or something while we're watching this, and let's get to it.
People are getting so mad about Elden Ring, which is kind of a pretty common thing nowadays. Elden Ring is such a break from normal video gaming tropes, and you'd think by now people would learn, but with its meteoric rise and success, people just can't understand it. I'm sure we all remember after the release of Elden Ring, those developers that came out talking about how terrible the games
Bro, those developers are so dumb. You're just dumb. You're just fucking dumb. You're so like all of these people that came out with this bullshit were so fucking stupid. I'm glad that somebody made that meme of like the ideal UX for these dumbasses, which would be like, oh, you gotta make sure to put like all of these crazy fucking UI elements, pollute the entire game, make sure to give us like an objective tracker, give us all of these things that modern games apparently need to have. And it's like, no, y'all wrong. Y'all wrong and dumb, and your games fucking blow. That's why you're all just like fucking obsessing over the success of Elden Ring. Get the fuck out of here. Get the actual fuck out of here, bro. Like, Elden Ring is the game that is doing it right, and y'all just need to fucking shut the fuck up and learn. You can either shut the fuck up and learn, or you can bitch and cry about it, which is what they did. They bitch and cry. My UX. It's like, bitch, your UX fucking sucks dick. How's that for a UX, huh? Elden Ring did it right. And all of these dudes were fucking salty. They were like mad. And let me tell you, the main reason why they're mad isn't even because Elden Ring is more successful than these other games. It's because Elden Ring is more successful than these other games with a smaller budget. That's what really pisses them off, because they're like, they gotta poke holes in it, because they're like, there's no way they should be able to be doing this game with this little budget. They shouldn't be allowed. Yeah, clearly their UX is terrible. Yeah. I need an objective marker and an arrow pointing me towards the next objective. I need a fucking GPS and a minimap. Shut the fuck up, bitch. Get good. Learn how to video game develop. How about that?
UI was, and how
you guys remember the meme, learn to code? That's what these people need.
user-friendly the quest design was. Well, we kinda have a similar situation on our hands. Recently, pretty much all the conversation in the gaming sphere has been on the upcoming Game Awards. And of course, Elden Ring is a nominee for Game of the Year. Well, in light of that, all the other nominees for other categories at the Game Awards have also been revealed, and Elden Ring is nominated for 7 total categories. Those of which are Game of the Year, Best RPG, Best Art Direction, Best Game Direction, Best Score and Music, Best Sound Design, and the one that has a lot of people up in arms, Best Narrative. And that's what we're gonna break down. But as we get into it today, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button if you want to stay up to date on all the Elden Ring coverage. I'm making it my goal to try to get to 70k before the Game Awards, because there's a big chance Elden Ring DLC is going to be announced there. And of course, I'm gonna try to stay on top of that for you guys. But now let's get into it. Some of y'all might remember a little bit of drama I had.
We're gonna be streaming the Game Awards, by the way, most likely here on Twitch. So be sure to tune in when that comes around. If it's not on Twitch, it'll be on YouTube. But yeah, we're definitely streaming that. At least I hope so, unless something comes up and I'm not able to. But I should be able to.
Back in the day over whether or not Elden Ring's storytelling is good or bad. And it's kind of that same argument that's popped up again, because people can't seem to understand why Elden Ring would be nominated for Best Narrative when the story is so convoluted and hard to understand, especially when compared to other games like God of War Ragnarok, which has a story that anybody who picks up the controller and plays the game is going to understand and comprehend on their first playthrough.
I think that, again, the important thing is that, to me, narrative and story are two different things. I just feel like a lot of the categories in the Game Awards are not properly defined, which is why you talk about narrative, but you're basically placing everything in there. It's story, lore, all of these things. I think that if you would just put best story, I don't think there would be as much discussion around it.
Elden Ring does not follow that route whatsoever. The primary story of Elden Ring is told in obscurity. Your character is dropped off in this dead and decaying world and only given the scraps of what happened. And it's part of your job as a player of the game to seek out more fragments of what happened through the tales of other characters and item descriptions of the things you pick up in the world. And that's how the game treats you, the player, and the characters that inhabit that world. You only know what your player character would know, and considering you're an undead that just came back to life in this state of the world, they're not going to know very much. And this is where people get lost, because the game never actually tells you that. So an unsuspecting player who is unfamiliar with the way these games work would rightfully feel confused. And so the question surrounding all of this becomes, is a story that's not told to you directly still a narrative? Let's look at the definition of narrative. Narrative is defined as a spoken or written account of connected events, a story. And there's an important part in there, spoken or written. And as I mentioned earlier, the majority of Elden Ring's lore is told through the item descriptions and tiny bits of text we can pick up throughout the game. And on top of that, the environmental storytelling is top notch. Everything in this game is placed the way it is for a reason, and every character you meet is going to give you some bit of exposition to a degree. But even if you don't want to take the time to decipher all of that, the game still gives you a clear objective. The cutscenes, though few and far between, paint a good picture of what the background of the world is. However, according to the definition of narrative, it encompasses everything. So if we take the story of Elden Ring with every one of its pieces in place, there's a narrative here, and a very strong one at that. And if you consider all of From Software's past titles, I think Elden Ring does a fantastic job at integrating both story and gameplay in a way that newer players can understand in a hands-off approach. And it's through this understanding that I'm going to approach all these criticisms of the game being nominated for Best Narrative, because I strongly believe that when we break all of this down, almost none of them hold water. And I'll explain. In fairness, when From hides the story of their game behind literally hundreds of secrets and item descriptions that most will never see, it's harder to catch that they didn't bother to include a few chapters worth of key story beats. While I can definitely understand how people come to this conclusion, that the game somehow leaves out key details, I simply don't think it's true. The intro cutscene
The game doesn't leave out key details. You can ignore them because, again, this goes back to the previous discussion that we were having about games holding your hand too much. Now we also expect games to drip feed you every single thing and you never have to search for anything. Not only like the story of the game, you know, after reading that definition of narrative, I'm coming around quite a bit, because I hadn't looked up the definition of narrative. I just had this construct in my mind of what a narrative is, and that a narrative should include more narration. But if a narrative can be explained, can be basically just like written, technically speaking, without it involving nearly as much dialogue. I'm coming around on that definition, because I said it from the start, I think the story of Elden Ring is better. The thing is, nowadays, every video game just kind of like drip feeds you everything and holds your hand and does everything for you. So people are less inclined to actually look up things when they are playing a video game. You're not meant to understand the story of Elden Ring in your first playthrough. This is okay. You're meant to understand it over longer periods of time and throughout community discussions and stuff like that. And that actually makes it more interesting from a story perspective, at least in my opinion. So yeah.
Does do a good job at painting the picture of what happened, but the things that it leaves out are questions that the player would naturally have when they're exploring the world. For example, probably the first question on everybody's mind when they watch the intro cutscene is what actually is the Elden Ring? Now, if you're somebody that played through the game, took the time to read the item descriptions, you would realize that the true nature of the Elden Ring is one of the biggest twists in the story. The characters that inhabit the world think they know what the Elden Ring is, but in actuality, nobody does. It's a fundamental player in the story that is left out of context for a reason. And once again, that's a common practice for From Software games. The stories are built on fragmentation. They want you to ask more questions than you get answered. Now, of course, that may not be everybody's cup of tea. I can understand that that type of storytelling isn't for everyone. However, that's very much still a strong narrative in its own right. Now, the initial poster of a tweet said, nah, narratives are more than what you're being walked through.
Narratives are more than what you're being walked through. It's also lore and world building, and Elden Ring has tons of it. Now, people not wanting to look into that as much is fair. Some people want to be walked through it, but to say it's a farce is disingenuous. None of that is narrative. Narrative is special to how the story is told. See, this is the concept, the construct that I had in my head about what narrative is. Something Elden Ring doesn't do is tell you a story. This is best lore, world building, or story. It's best narrative. See, again, I feel like this wouldn't be as much of an issue if they just called it best story. I think that best narrative, I think a lot of people probably have the same construct of narrative as I do. I mean, let me drop that that definition again. Spoken or written account of connected events, a story. In a form of or concerned with narration in narrative poem, essays, fairy tales, autobiographies, and news stories. Even news stories are considered narratives. Topics and examples of narrative style writing. God. Why are you like this? Powerful resumes and cover letters. What? What is narrative writing? One of the most effective ways of storytelling and written communication is through narrative writing. To simplify the term, narrative is a classical rhetorical method of presenting information. Writers use a narrative style to present their point of view through chronological matter. See, this tells us a different thing. There are flashbacks and multiple timelines. Some of the popular examples of narrative writing include essays, fairy tales, autobiographies, and news stories. 5 core elements of narrative writing that define the narrative: plot, setting, characters, conflict, and theme. Yep. He is right.
It's also lore and world building, and Elden Ring has tons of it. Now, people not wanting to look into it, that much is fair. Some people want to be walked through it, but to say it's a farce is disingenuous in my opinion. Now, as we just explained, they're exactly right. Narrative encompasses everything, but the reply to this tweet shows the flaw in these people's arguments. None of that is narrative. Narrative, especially how the story is told. Something Elden Ring doesn't do is tell you a story. This isn't best lore, world building, or story, it's best narrative. Now, aside from that statement just being blatantly false, it illustrates a big problem in the gaming industry as a whole, that the line between cinema and game is growing ever thinner. To go back to my point about God of War, part of the reason I personally did not enjoy that game near as much as Elden Ring is because it is a very strong guided experience. The game wants the player to do one thing and go about their journey in one way, so that the player gets the story the first time and eliminates the chance that they don't. When you have a game that implements this style of storytelling, naturally it's going to cater to a wider audience because it's more accessible. It's easier to chew. However, one of the drawbacks of this is that it has to remove control from the player. And the most common form of this is through cutscenes. cutscenes. Now, they can disguise it with QuickTime events, but at the end of the day, it becomes more of a movie than a game. And after all, these are the Game Awards. When you pick up Elden Ring and play through the game, there are very few times it ever takes control away from the player. This is a game that focuses on freedom and the player's exploration. It wants you to get as much of the story as you choose to find, and that amount is completely subjective to the work the player puts in to discover it. If a player does not get the story out of this game, it's because of their own choices. That's not a fault of the game. Again, you may not like it, but that's still just as strong of a narrative point as a game that forces you to be told its story. Except if I have to search a YouTube video every time to understand every single thing is not little effort. Not only this, many things in the game you have to search some sort of guide or YouTube video. What's the point of the game then? That's bad design.
Remember what we talked about earlier about video games being too handholdy and fundamentally breathing this type of player? This is where we're at. Players are not, it's like, listen, there are some things that I will not understand in a Souls game. It happens often, like I'll play through it a million times and there will still be things that I don't understand. Because I'm not particularly, and this is like a thing specifically to me. One of the things that I've noticed is that I'm not a particularly good researcher, which is why I have difficulty with stuff like that. And in that case, yeah, sure, I might go look up a YouTube video if I'm interested, and that's fine. That's perfectly fine. If you want to look up a YouTube video to better understand the story of these games, I think that is fine. But I also think that you need to take into account the intention of the developers, and the intention is that this is a community shared experience. This is from back in the days where you would post things on, community boards and stuff like that, and that is where you would get the discussion of the game. It's like a puzzle that is being solved by a wide array of people, where people might be like, oh, but did you consider the description of this item? And you're like, oh my God, that completely, gives me a new perspective on the thing that I was looking at with this description of this item that you just gave me. And this is a good thing. It generates community discussion. It generates community interaction. It is a very positive thing.
Now, this is a point that we've gone over so many times, and I've made several videos breaking down exactly why this isn't true. I really can't stand the mindset that you have to watch YouTube videos and
my main problem with the story in Elden Ring is that inevitably, no matter how interesting a character's story is, you end up fighting and killing them. It limits character development because your main interaction with them is violence. Do you always have to kill them? I forget if there's a boss that you can spare, but like, for instance, if you look at Dark Souls, you don't have to kill Priscilla. You can go through that whole world, and then you can leave, and you don't have to kill the final boss. That is one of the situations where you don't have to kill a boss in a Soulsborne game. And I think there's a couple more. I'm not sure if there's any in Elden Ring that you get to skip or not. But, yeah, it's like, it's not always as black and white as that. Like, also, you can interact with, what's-his-face, the Dung Eater in different ways that don't necessarily just involve you killing him. You can spare patches. Exactly. You don't have to kill patches, you just have to give him a beatdown. There are things,
in order to find something or understand something in this game. You don't. The fact that the videos exist in the first place proves them wrong, because somebody originally had to find that information in the game in order to make the video. As I stated before, what you find and what you understand is directly correlated to the work you put in to achieve it. Now,
and one of the better aspects even is that certain things in Soulsborne games are open to interpretation, which makes the storytelling that much more interesting.
If you want to talk about the quest design, yes, there are story elements to be gained by doing NPC quests, but as I stated earlier, this is a game that has a lot of player choice. It's impossible to do every quest in one playthrough. There are 6 different endings that all depend on the choices that you make as a player in your journey. Just because you feel entitled that you should be able to get everything out of it in one journey does not make the design bad. So I think the way to kind of address all this outrage is summed up very well.
The way to address all of this outrage is that some people just need to accept that some video games are not for them. It's just that it's like I solved the problem. Some people just need to accept, some games are just not for you, man. That's all right. That's perfectly fine.
In a tweet that Sekiro Doobie posted that I really liked, Elden Ring dares to trust its own players. Also, another thing that terrifies people from Elden Ring is you can make your own narrative. There's no hand-holding. It's not clear who's good or bad, who's the hero, and there's a non-zero chance that your conclusions might be wrong. And I think that's absolutely correct. Although there is a definite story to this game, I think it's a very telling sign that a narrative is strong if it still leaves room for the personal interpretation of its player. Not knowing what's good or bad or who's right or wrong is a theme that the game drives home, and something that I believe should be rewarded is a game that manages to show more by telling less. And I believe that's Elden Ring's greatest strength when it comes to its narrative. And because of that, it absolutely deserves to be one of the nominees. But to close out my thoughts on this, if you've been around on the Souls games for a while, this is a topic that continues to come up every time a new game is released. And not once has it ever actually stood. It's an argument that's fundamentally built from either laziness or ignorance, and that might sound kind of harsh, but it's true. Just because a story is not instantly digestible does not mean it doesn't exist or it is bad. Sometimes the stories that take longer to process end up having a much more longer lasting impact, and the story of Elden Ring is a perfect example of that. But anyways guys, that's gonna pretty much do it for the video today. I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, be sure to leave a like on it. Let me know your thoughts on this down in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe if you're new around here. And just as a reminder, I will be streaming the Game Awards on December 8th. There's a very good chance we're gonna get the Elden Ring DLC trailer then, so you'll definitely want to tune in for that. But with all that, I'll catch you in the next one.
Sounds good. Sounds very good. Guys, do remember, check out the video. I agree. I agree with pretty much everything he said, and to be honest, he kind of like changed my mind, because I can't believe I never looked up the definition of what a narrative is. But I just always had this idea in my mind that a narrative, it just correlates so much with the word narration that it just led me to be like, okay, narrative is the way that the story is told. But no, there's much more to it than that. But I still think that the category would be better described as best story. Why do people use narrative instead of story? Kind of feel like story is a better description, but it could also be to the fact that I'm not a native English speaker, so it just makes more sense in my head like that. But yeah, might even be my Portuguese origins that lead me to that particular definition of narrative. Because I think that in narrative, Portuguese might have a different the Portuguese version of the word narrative might have a different meaning than the English version. Maybe. Should do more research on this topic. I'm like really confused. But yeah, do check out the video, guys. I linked it. Hit it up with a like and give it some watch time, because yeah, it's important.